This is going to be the very, very first episode of the Amazing Women in History podcast. I'm super excited. And here with me today is Anne Boyd Rioux. Thank you so much for joining me today. And you had actually contributed a guest post a couple of years back to the blog, which is why I reached out to you, because ever since then I've been a big fan. So you wrote a post a few years back about Constance Fenimore Wilson, who is a really cool, commercially successful novelist in the 19th century, which was a really rare thing. So we can talk a little bit about that. But also, like I said, like I've been a fan of you since then. I've been following your stuff. I know you were an English professor for a really long time. And since then, you left to follow your dreams of traveling and writing full time. And I would love to hear more about that as well. So thank you so much for volunteering to be my first subject.
Well, thank you, Keri, for inviting me.
Yeah. So let's just jump in and talk a little bit about Constance, I guess. You wrote a short post about her a few years back. And like I said, she was a novelist in the 1800s. And so I'm sure you know much more about this. I'm kind of a hobbyist in history and literature. So that in the 1800s, like for a woman to be a novelist was, from what I understand, they weren't really taken seriously, right?
Yeah, it was complicated. There were a lot of women writers, and I think we grow up with this perception that women didn't write much in the past. You know, there was Jane Austen
Yeah.
and George Eliot, Charlotte Bronte, and the other Brontes, and maybe that was about it. Emily Dickinson, you know, squirreling her poems away into her drawers, you know, saving them for posterity. But there actually, I mean, I discovered in graduate school, there were so many women writers. If you look at scenes of the day, many of which are digitized now. You know, you look at the table of contents, the list of contributors, and there are a lot of women among them. And a lot of names start to stand out. And when you start to read their stuff, you realize that a lot of it was really good. It's just been forgotten and buried in the archives. And there are a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah, that's the sad thing. Like nobody has heard of her today. Like I had never heard her name before you sent this article in.
Right.
But she was really popular back then. It seems like
she was. So she was what was really unique about her was that she kind of pulled off the most difficult thing for a writer, which is to be critically acclaimed and popular. Okay, so she was so she was very widely regarded in her time, and she had an exclusive contract with Harper's to write for their magazines and for her books to be published by them. That was extremely rare. Henry James was terribly jealous. I mean, Henry James was a very close friend of hers, and he, of course, is the master, right? He's, you know, there are volume upon volume upon volume of biographies out there on him. No one had written a biography of Constance Fenimore Wilson. Her works were out of print, and I decided I would write her biography, and I did. It was published in 2016. I wouldn't say it was a smash, my book, but it did have an impact. And I mean, it gave her visibility that she'd never had before. And it was really important to me actually to publish that book as a trade book. So not as an academic, not with an academic publisher. My first book was published by an academic publisher and it cost $85. And my mom and my dad bought it. And other than that, it was just libraries. You know, no one could afford to buy it. So, which was very frustrating to me. And it took, you know, like over a year to get any reviews in academic journals. You know, it was very disappointing. I didn't want that for Wilson. I was writing this biography so that she'd become more widely known. And I knew that meant taking her beyond the ivory tower, so to speak. There'd been this whole movement inside academia to recover all these interesting women writers from the 19th century, getting them republished, but they were disappearing again. The books were going, you know, the collection of her stories that had been reprinted in the 1980s was out of print again in the 21st century. And I knew that she needed wider exposure. And so I did find an agent and get the book published with Norton. And that meant that the book was reviewed by major news outlets. And it was actually reviewed on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. It was Women's History Month. And Elaine Showalter had just published a biography of another woman writer from a little bit earlier, but the 19th century had also been forgotten, Julia Ward Howe. And so our two books were on the cover, and that was huge. That was really amazing. And there were really great reviews, not only of the biography, but then also a collection of her stories that I edited with Norton. So she was back in print again. And the reviews were generous and lovely, and they loved Wilson's writing. I mean, everybody did. And a few years later, the Library of America contacted me about publishing a collection of her stories. And wow,
Oh
that was
wow.
incredible. The Library of America is essentially the canon of American literature. And the thing that's really special about them is that their books never go out of print. So she has been inducted now into this, this into literary posterity, so to speak. She's been ushered back into it, and I'm very proud of that. Very happy that
Yeah, all because of you.
she's
Yeah, without your
secured
book, that
this.
wouldn't have happened. And that's so interesting. So she's never gone out of print. That's amazing. I love
Well,
it. And you,
now she
yeah,
will
it
never
just
go out
like
of print
it,
as long as books are published in the Library of
yeah,
America survives.
yeah,
That
I
book will
love
be in
that.
print. Yeah, it's a collection of her stories. I think
Yeah.
she particularly excels in the short story form, but she also has some interesting novels. The Front Yard is her short novella that's really quite interesting. Or not The Front Yard, I'm sorry, For the Major. But she had lots of interesting stories set in the U.S. in the 1870s and 80s, and then also in Europe. So she was an expat. And this kind of leads into my story because, or why I was so drawn to her, was that she was an expat. Yeah, she moved in 1880 or 1879. She left the U.S. and she never returned. And she ended up living in Italy for many years, but she also lived in England. She had this really long, fabulous trip to Egypt that she took. She spent time, but she wrote a lot about the expats of the time, and that's when she met Henry James, and they became very close friends. Now they decided she made a pact with him that they would destroy their letters to each other, and that was her idea.
Oh wow, really?
Because yes, because she knew that he read them aloud to other people. People have read all kinds of stuff into this. Oh, there must have been some relationship. They were trying to hide something, and no, she just wanted privacy. She wanted to have a one-on-one conversation with
Yeah, yeah.
him in her
Yeah.
letters, and she did the same thing with her sister actually. So she didn't want them to share her letters. She wanted to be free to express herself. And
Yeah.
anyway, she's a very interesting
Yeah, and I think
character.
I don't I was gonna say I think any of us can empathize with that, but maybe not in the day of social media when we're also used to just
She would not have been on
updating
Twitter, I can
everyone
tell you
everywhere. But
that. She would not have been on Twitter.
yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah. Because of that
Oh,
day, women had to hide themselves behind a mask
mm-hmm,
of social propriety and femininity. And
mm-hmm.
Wilson, I think, was a very passionate person. And it comes out in her writing um, in kind of interesting ways. There'll be a character who has some kind of explosive moment, and you're like, whoa, moment of truth in the story. This character speaking the truth when the main character is repressed and
Yeah.
can't. Things like that are really interesting. And
Mm,
I think she was very interested in how people in the 19th century was such a repressive era. This is the Victorian era, and she's like
yeah.
upper middle class, and part of this sort of genteel world, and she's feeling like so many people, but women in particular, had to hide themselves behind these
Mm-hmm.
masks of social propriety. And I think that made it very difficult for me as biographer to tell her story, to get behind the mask, who was the real Constance Fenimore Wilson.
Yeah, you have to kind of
Um,
read between the lines in her writing.
that's what I did. Yeah, that's exactly what I did. Was that I found her actually in her fiction more than I did in her
Mm.
letters, because she was often sort of playing a role to people.
And you mentioned that you really empathize with her as an expat. And do you want to
Yeah.
kind of use that as a segue to share a little bit about like your adventures and like how did you decide to leave academia and kind of, go off on your own and travel and write and what was that like?
Yeah, well, it was many years in the making for sure. For one, I
Yeah.
had a daughter at home still, and providing a stable environment for her to grow up in was job number one. But it was the date of her graduation and going off to college was sort of looming on the horizon. And at the same time, I was feeling hemmed in, I guess, kind of like Wilson was in the 19th century, by my role as an academic and by my job, my career. Being an academic is, I know a lot of people aspire to it, think it's, cushy life or looks like a great, a life of the mind and all of that. But it's grueling. It's grueling. It's 24/7. I mean, there's no, there are no prescribed hours, and they're just, with all the cuts that are going on in academia at
Oh
universities
yeah,
across
it's a
the
tough
country.
environment now, from what I understand.
It's just
I could
getting
never do it
harder.
myself.
It's getting harder and harder. Yeah, I know a lot of
Yeah, yeah,
there's been a sort of mass exodus, and I don't know, that's maybe
yeah.
overstating things, but there have been people like me who have tenure leaving the profession, and
Hmm.
that's something that you just
That's
didn't see.
huge.
It's huge. It is huge. It's like
Yeah.
the quality of life that we're experiencing as academics is so low that we're willing to give up tenure,
Mm.
a secure job for life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of reasons, but so I was becoming disenchanted with my career, but then also I really loved writing books. And the reason I wrote the
Yeah.
biography of Wilson had a lot to do with my desire for her story to be known and for her to be better known. But it also had to do, I think, with my
Yeah.
own ambitions as a writer. I didn't want to write scholarship anymore. I wanted to write something that would be read. I wanted to have an audience. I wanted to write a story. I wanted to tell a story. And writing biography seemed like a stepping stone towards that. But academic training is pretty intense, and you get things drilled into you, and it's really hard. They're not teaching you how to be a good writer or a good teacher, for that matter. They're teaching you how to do research and how to make an argument,
Yeah.
and that felt stifling to me. And I realized that I'd studied all these women
Hmm.
writers because I really wanted to be one myself, but I didn't have the guts to do it. And I had been studying them, trying to figure out, how did they do it? How did they figure out how to be a writer when they were also women? What were the challenges of that? That's so much of my first book is about that, which is about
Hmm.
women writers' ambitions. And these were women who were the first generation of serious women artists in the US. And Emily Dickinson, it's sort of that era. And she didn't publish, so I didn't include her in the book. She hardly published at
Yeah.
all. But I included Woolson and also some other writers who were publishing a lot and getting a lot of critical attention and aspired to be taken seriously as writers, to be artists. Another one of those figures was Louisa May Alcott. I ended up writing another book after the Wilson biography on Little Women because Little Women was having its 150th anniversary. And that book, Meg, Jo, Beth, Amy, came out in 2018 for the anniversary. And that was very exciting. But I realized, though, that I wasn't going to be satisfied writing books like that, researched books anymore, that I had my own stories that I wanted to tell and to explore,
Yeah.
and writing a novel has always been a dream of mine. Um, and I was going through a lot of big changes in my family, in my life situation. And I think a lot of us during the pandemic started thinking about our lives and whether we were on the path that we wanted to be on, right? And so I
Yeah.
decided, when my daughter went off to college, that I would go with her. Not to college, but I'd fly the coop as well. And I bought a one-way
Wow.
ticket to Paris. Yeah, I sold my house, quit my job,
I love
left
it.
my
Yeah, and I
marriage.
remember reading about that in
Yeah,
your newsletter because
yeah.
that was my bucket list trip. Was my I went to Paris luckily before the pandemic, and it was
Oh,
just an
good.
amazing trip, and I love
Yeah.
it so much. So I was reading your newsletter and like, I'm so happy for you.
Oh, thank you. Well, it has been quite an adventure, I'll say. I'm still traveling,
Yeah.
and I still don't have a home base. I have my mom's address as my permanent residence, for now,
Yeah, but
back
yeah,
in
this is a
Maryland. But
whole new start for you.
it
Everything.
is, yeah, no, it is. It's really just about starting over and figuring out, what
Hmm.
it is that I exactly want from the rest of my life. And
Yeah.
it took me a while to figure it out, but what I realized is that more than anything, I do want to be a writer. So I didn't set out saying, I'm going to go be a writer. I said, I was so confused and so, muddled. And I was still very afraid. I was still very afraid of writing, of putting my eggs in that basket. And I gave myself the time basically to travel and meet people and think about different ways of living, outside of our little American bubble. The people live very different lives in Europe, different places. And so I started in Paris, but then I lived for a month at the Dormar House in Provence, France, on the south of France. And the Dormar, I mean, I went there for a writing residency, but I realized I'm in the house of this woman and her presence was just there, in the walls everywhere. Her artwork is on the walls and there are books about her on the bookshelf. So I'm like, okay, I got to find out who Dora Maar was. And I just became obsessed. The whole month I was reading about her. And she was a very fascinating woman. She was one of Picasso's mistresses. They were together for 8 or 9 years or something. And he was very cruel to her. And she was an artist, though. She was maybe the first, maybe the only of his mistresses who was an artist herself when he met her. And unfortunately, he messed with her, mind, in terms of the art she was doing, because she was an incredible surrealist photographer, really super interesting work. But he basically told her that it was, photography second rate. You have to draw, you have to paint if you're really an artist.
Yeah.
And so she started painting. And a lot of people say she never reached the same artistic level as she did when she was a photographer. But learning about her and how she survived Picasso, really, that's the thing I was most interested in, because she had this house that she got from him. Actually, it was almost like a parting gift, and this house where she would spend her summers. She was there for 50 years. She lived for 50 years after this life-defining relationship with Picasso. That's all anybody knows about her now, really. And she had another 50 years of her life, in that house. She didn't have any other relationships. She devoted herself to her art, and she figured out how to live on her own, as this strong woman. I mean, people pitied her. They thought she was, sad and kind of insane, and she had cats and, oh my God. But I realized I was digging, I was trying to figure out, well, how did she do it? And I needed to know that she had survived him, that she hadn't just suffered away all of those years in that house. And I came to the realization after a lot of reading, the only real biography of hers written in Spanish. So I ended up with my phone, doing Google Translate. I discovered you could take a picture with the Google Translate app and it would translate the text for you. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. I can use this with menus when I go out to eat. It was so great. But I used it on her book, and it did a lot of funky stuff, but it also gave me this sense of who she really was, because there apparently were all these writings in French and Spanish, maybe in Spanish too. I'm not sure. She'd grown up in a Spanish-speaking country. I can't remember which one, but anyway, she was just a fascinating figure, and that was right at the beginning of my year. I was giving myself a year to travel, and I realized that I was all alone on this trip. This was a solo trip. I didn't know people in most of the places that I was going to, and these women, I started collecting these women from the past as I was traveling. They were my constant companions in a way. Yeah, it was very exciting actually, because what I was doing is I realized that these, I spent my life studying women in the past, these women writers, and looking to them really for guidance. I mean, I realized the reason Wilson's life attracted me so much is because she did what I really wanted to do, which, was write and travel, live abroad, have this life as an expat. And the women writers that I had studied since then, I mean, Louisa May Alcott spent time abroad too, but I was writing a biography of Kay Boyle. Kay Boyle was a writer, an American writer who lived abroad for many years from the 20s. She was part of that 20s scene of writers in Paris. And she met a lot of the writers of the day there, Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, and lots of other people who were lesser known today. and she lived through the 30s in southern France and also in Austria. She witnessed the rise of the Nazis there and wrote amazing stories and a really cool novel about that time. And then she lived in England briefly,
Wow.
then she went back to France, and she was in France when Germany invaded. And wow, she wrote these incredible stories about the war. She had this incredible life where she fell in love with this Austrian man who was a refugee of the Nazis hiding out in the Alps in France. And she fell helplessly in love with
Oh, wow.
him. And he went to the US with her. They got married. He went into the army. He ended up becoming recruited by the OSS, which was the forerunner of the CIA. So they sent him back to his home country of Austria and as a spy at the end of World War II, and he helped liberate his hometown of Innsbruck, the end of the war.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
And
and
she was with
then
him at that time?
no, she was, but she wasn't with him. He was having these adventures, and she was waiting at home to hear, get these letters about it. But then after the
Oh.
war, so his story really interested me, and their amazing love affair interested me. And then after the war, he was stationed in Germany working for the State Department, and she went there. Now we're talking 1946, 47, 48, right after the
Hmm.
war. And she's writing the most amazing stories for the New Yorker about that time. They sent her there on a foreign
Wow.
correspondence pass, not to write journalism, but to write fiction, to write stories about what it really was like in Germany right after the war. So she's writing about all of this, and they're absolutely fascinating historical documents and literary documents. They're amazing literature. She won 2 O. Henry
Wow.
Awards
And again,
for her
like
short
I've never
stories.
heard of her before. It's like,
Nobody's
that's
heard of her.
crazy.
Nobody knows her anymore. Nobody knows her anymore. And
Yeah, it's
she was
sad.
such an important
It's really
writer.
sad.
So she's
Yeah.
been with me on my
That's
travels.
incredible.
She's
I love that
actually,
story.
yeah, I think she's actually the one that made me, she's the one you asked me before, like how
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
decided to do this, why I did this. And I think I have to say Kay Boyle. She so inspired me. That's why I was drawn to her, of course, is because look at this huge life that she lived
Yeah.
and amazing writing that she did. She was in fact, writing her biography is just an overwhelming task because her life is just such a big life. But
Yeah.
she made me want to live a bigger life, to be honest. And so she's definitely
Yeah.
been with me, and I've been thinking about her a lot while I've been traveling. And she's been inspiring some of the writing that I'm doing, not biography, but memoir and fiction that I've been writing. So Dora Maar, Kay Boyle have been with me, and then I picked up this book in a Paris bookshop that had a feather on the cover. It was called Toward Another Summer, and on the back it talks about how the main character is a woman writer who thinks she's a migratory bird. And I thought, that's
Hmm.
cool. Curious about
Yeah.
that. And so she's living in London, but she's from New Zealand. It turns out it's a very autobiographical novel written by the novelist Janet Frame, whom I'd never heard of. Well, she was considered a shoo-in, a ringer for winning the Nobel Prize, and she almost did, but she didn't.
Really?
Yeah, she's a really
Oh, wow.
important New Zealand writer, and really great writer. And this book is so interesting, and it just led me in this. It was this doorway into her life. So she lived many years abroad as a writer. So I got really interested in her. Meanwhile, while I'm traveling, I'm trying to write about my travels. I'm trying to figure out how to share what I'm doing with people. And I decided to pour myself into my newsletter.
Yeah.
While I was traveling, it turned into more personal stories about my travels, but then also things I was thinking about, in terms of what it means to start your life over, what a meaningful life is, and how to figure that out. And then
Yeah.
also the stories of these women that I was like, I've written about Dora Maar and Kay Boyle and Janet Frame and others. And so because I'm not traveling as much now, so I spent a year traveling and I fell in love with Scotland, and I've been spending more time here and kind of, settling in here, doing more writing and, just still kind of finding my legs and trying to figure out how to,
Yeah. I love that.
yeah,
And I would love
where
to hear
live and
about,
how.
are there any like big projects that you're working on right now? Like what's next for you in the future? Are you going to publish another book soon? Like, are you still
Well, I don't know about
discovering
soon,
all
but
these women's stories?
yeah. So what I'm working on now is a kind of braided memoir of my year of travel with these stories of the women that I've sort of collecting along the way.
Awesome. I love
Other
that. Kind of
writers,
like as a
yeah.
framing device for the stories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's also that their stories are really couched within mine, about like how I discover them, what they mean
Hmm.
to me, how how I'm kind of figuring out my new life and how I want to
Hmm.
be in the world by reading them and learning about their lives and the choices that they made in their lives. Because all of these women made
Yeah.
difficult choices at some point, bold choices, courageous choices to live lives that weren't ordinary for women. That's what interests me about them. And that's how my newsletter, my Substack, has sort of evolved now into telling more of their stories. It's called now Audacious Women Creative Lives. And some of the posts are about the writing life, kind of issues we face as women when we're writers. I mean, nobody's really talking so much about that anymore. It's like it's almost gone out of fashion to gather women together, talk amongst ourselves about,
Yeah.
the challenges that we still face. The voices in our heads telling us that what we're doing is selfish.
Hmm.
That's a big one. Women still really
Yeah.
struggle
I don't
with
know if you've
this.
ever heard of this.
Yeah.
There's this book I read. I think it was published in the 70s. It was called How to Suppress Women Writers. And like each chapter is like
Yeah. Joanna
going through
Russ.
different
Yeah.
ways that
Yeah.
yes, yeah, and
Yeah.
phenomenal book. But what's crazy about it is that so many things are still true today. Like it's
They're
still
still
going on.
true.
It's still
They're still
happening.
true. Yes. I know
Yeah.
we've accomplished a lot. We've gained a lot of freedoms and rights. But I think there's still many hurdles for us to overcome in terms of being able to, I guess, be individuals, right? And not really think of ourselves as
Yeah.
women. We're still raised very much
Yeah.
to view ourselves as sexual objects as opposed to desiring subjects, objects of desire rather
A
than
hundred
desiring
percent.
subjects,
Yeah.
which is one of the posts I wrote about recently was about desire and the woman writer. So sometimes I talk about things like that, but a lot, what this is all just coming
Hmm.
out of the women that I've been studying, the
Yeah.
1990s when I was in graduate school. I see these recurring themes. The thing that really got me when I was writing Wilson's biography, and I was studying these women from the 19th century, and I was sharing them with my students, and my students were getting, I remember one day in class we were reading Nathaniel Hawthorne, this quote. We were talking about a quote from him in one of his private letters to his publisher. He complained about the damned mob of scribbling women, publishing novels, selling by the hundred thousands, and no one's paying attention to him. And worse, their novels could not be, or whatever. And one of my
Yeah.
female students was getting like, oh, she's just so irritated, and she was like shifting around in her seat. And I said, well, what is this bringing up for you? What are you thinking? And she said, well, you know what? This is still going on today. And she was in the MFA
Yeah.
program. She was a writer, and she started talking about all the things that were happening and the Vita count and just all these things. And I it was like she opened a new world to me, a door to the present, because I've been living in the 19th century, looking at what women writers had been facing then, and didn't realize they're still facing this shit now. And
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
there was this period when we were very there was so much talk about that. There was so much, the fact that women's
Hmm.
bylines didn't appear in proportion to
Hmm. Hmm.
men's, in the major literary magazines. Their books weren't being reviewed as often. There was this, and things did get better after all that exposure and talking about it. Things did get better, but the
Hmm.
underlying issues
But even
remain.
like no matter how much better it gets, it doesn't erase what happened in the past. And I think about like, are there any like really cool women novelists who just never got that chance to get published because they were women, and we'll just never know their names and we'll never be able to read their
There is
stuff.
that.
Like,
There is that. I think there's a larger number even of women who never wrote at all because they thought they couldn't because they were women.
yeah,
And a large
yep,
part of
yep.
that, and nobody really talks about this, a large part of that is the fact that when we look into the past, we don't see anything. We look back there and all we see
Hmm.
are male writers, and we think, we in high school, I know my daughter, She's in
Yeah.
college now, but boy, when she was in high school, they only
Yeah, and
read
you
male
ask anyone, you
writers.
ask any student in high school
It's
hey,
still
name
happening.
five famous writers and five famous artists, and I will bet you money they will all name men because
Yes.
that's what we're
Or
taught, and
four
that's
out
what
of
comes to
five at
mind.
the,
Yeah.
might be the
Yeah.
best case
Yep.
scenario. But yes.
Yeah.
So girls are still growing up thinking that to be a
Yep.
woman writer is
Exactly.
somehow an anomaly. It's somehow unusual. And the
Yeah.
fact is that
Yep.
it's not. It's been going on for centuries. Women have been writing and they've been disappeared. They've been suppressed. They've been
Yep.
buried. And I get angry
Yeah.
sometimes. You tell me, a little frustrated
Me too.
when people just say, "Oh, it wasn't a conscious thing. There wasn't suppression. It was just, oh, been lots of books in the past that were
It
forgotten.
completely was
Lots of
a
men's books that
conscious
were
thing.
forgotten.
It
Sure,
was
there
very
were.
purposeful.
But yes, it would. Yes, exactly. No, it was. It was. I do believe it was. It's not a coincidence that all of the women
Hmm.
writers from the 19th century, who are American at least, were completely forgotten and not taught and not published, not in anthologies, except for Emily Dickinson.
Hmm.
She was the exception. And sometimes you'd encounter Harriet Beecher Stowe in like a history class kind of context, but not in a literary
Hmm.
context. So there's so much work that was so what happens when a young woman is growing up and she doesn't see any women writers in the past, or she sees only a
Yeah.
couple, or she sees Virginia Woolf and she thinks, oh my God, I can't be Virginia Woolf. So,
Right.
how am I
Yeah.
ever going to get? Yeah. So there needs to be, I think, a greater awareness of these women writers in the past, first of all, which is like my number one mission,
Absolutely.
I think. I want people
Yep.
to know there are all these amazing women writers and
Yeah,
artists who've been
same here.
doing incredible
Yeah.
things.
And
Yes, I think.
that too, like I always in school I always thought I never really liked history much in school. I thought it was boring learning about, wars and and
It
all
was
that
terribly
stuff. Like that
boring.
was incredibly boring to me.
Yes.
Yeah, and then when I yes, I was never interested in any of that stuff, but like when I read individual people's stories, and especially like, individual women that I could relate to, and it was like, wow, these were real people that lived in history and they were just like me and they had, these struggles. And that is interesting to me. That's the
Yes,
part of history
yes,
that's
real
interesting to me
people's
is these
lives, and
individual
yes,
people.
and that's the
Yeah.
thing is that I go back and I look at these women who were writing, and so I've been, I have to say that I studied 19th century women writers, and that's what my scholarship was on. But I've gravitated more towards the 20th century women writers and artists. They interest me
Mm.
because they were doing bolder things, right? They started, there wasn't all this suppressed passion, like in Wilson's writing where she's trying, she feels so hemmed in, and, it comes out in these little bits and pieces.
Hmm.
Instead, you have someone like Kay Boyle who's writing, much more overtly about the passions her characters are experiencing. And
Yeah.
yeah, and also women living lives so much more unconventional lives in the 20th century. And a lot of the women
Yeah.
who were doing that were expats. They lived outside of their home country. They left home. I think
Yeah, that makes
women,
sense.
in a lot
Hmm.
of ways, I think women had to leave home and apart from the social context in which they were living. And I realized at some point, oh my God, that's
Yeah.
exactly what I did. That's why I'm traveling. That's why I did this. That's
Yes.
why I left, because I had to break out of
Yeah,
this
to kind of break
bubble.
free.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where, I'd become a mother, a professor, a wife, and I couldn't see myself anymore. I didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
I didn't know who I was. And it took me almost a year of travel before I started seeing myself. And and so you asked me before about my writing project. So I've been writing a memoir about that year called A Year of One's Own.
That I love that.
Sometimes a woman needs more than a room of her own. Sometimes she needs a whole year of
Yes.
time and
Yes.
space,
Yeah, I love
to.
that. There was a book about women scientists called A Lab of One's Own. I feel like
Mhm.
that's just always always a good book title.
Yes, yes. So there was a good book published, or an interesting one last year called A Life of One's Own, that is about
Mm.
women writers too, which is cool. But so I'm writing that, and I'm also, let's see, in that I talk about my travels in France, England, Sicily, Germany, Scotland, Those are kind of the main places that I went. So it's not like I'm skydiving, or I'm not like going to ashrams in India, or learning how to walk fire in Thailand. I don't know what, I'm not doing crazy stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm
Yeah.
I'm definitely outside of my comfort zone. I'm getting out of my comfort zone.
Right.
I'm learning
Yeah. Yeah.
how to live in just a more, sometimes you have to strip away, all the things that distract us
Mm-hmm.
in our lives. And what I've discovered is that I love being by the sea. I'm staying in a place right now, and I have been for a few months, and I'm going to have to leave soon, and I'm so sad. I'm working on that memoir, and I'm also brewing a novel, and
Awesome.
it is very much about these themes about women in the past, and how their lives reverberate in our own. So, and these issues about how hard it is to be a woman writer, an artist, and the choices that we have to
Mm-hmm.
make in our lives, the compromises, and the toll that takes on us. Yeah, and I do think that
Yeah.
our creativity is who we are. It's what makes us human, and when it's stifled out of us,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's
It
very
is, yeah.
wounding.
And
It's very
you
painful.
really need a
Hmm.
support. You need some kind of support system to really be able to explore. You need stability and you need support in order to really explore that side of yourself. And I feel like throughout history, that's been kind of something that most men have been pretty much guaranteed, whereas, women have
Hmm.
usually not had that.
Yeah, or just even the expectation that, oh, you will. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the book. So I would say of all the writers and artists that I've been collecting over this past over my travels, the one who's become my guiding light in some ways, not in all, but in some ways, is Simone de Beauvoir. And her book, The Second
Mm.
Sex, Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, it was such an eye opener to me. It was, I mean, we're talking about how these women's lives in the past are still relevant to our own. And this was a book that I had always assumed must be dated because it was written in the 40s, published in 1949. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's like this early feminist text, but what could it possibly have to say to women today? That was my naive, I guess, belief when I was growing up, and I didn't ever read it. And I read it last year, and it just blew the top of my head off. It was like, wow, she had it all. She saw it all. She's had it all figured out. And
Yeah.
the one thing that really sticks with me is that women. Oh, so the way she describes it. So men basically are raised to see themselves, to define themselves through their work, their projects. She's always talking about having your project. And the work
Mm.
defines them, gives them their sense of purpose, their sense of who they are in the world. Women, historically, culturally, have been taught to define themselves through their relationships, through love, through finding a
Mm-hmm.
man. And this was very literal in my mother's generation and in earlier women's generations. If you wanted to be a doctor, you married a doctor. You couldn't be a doctor yourself, so you would
Yeah.
marry one, live vicariously through him. If you wanted to be a writer, you
Yeah.
married one. You became Vera Nabokov or something, helping your husband realize
Mm-hmm.
his dreams, and becoming part of a pair, who maybe you were very involved in
Yeah.
his career, but,
That's
his name's on the books.
still the default today. It's still very much the default today, I believe. I mean, I read Michelle Obama's book, her autobiography, and
Mm.
I felt sad for her because I just felt like
Talk about being
she could have been
overshadowed,
so
huh?
much on her own, and
Yeah.
she just
Yeah.
sacrificed so much over and over and over again. Yeah.
Wow. 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 I have
And that's
not
the
read it.
default. It's like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
No, it is the
if you're in a
default.
powerful partnership and you're both ambitious, like you default to the
Somebody
man's
has to.
ambition.
Especially if you have
Yep.
kids, but I don't know, becoming president's kind of extreme, but still, it still happens. Absolutely. And
It's an extreme example, but yeah.
no, but it's still very much true. I think you're right. And I think though, at the sort of bedrock though, of who we think we are, I think for women still very much, there's this feeling that they have to have a man who's attached to them in some way
Hmm.
to give themselves meaning
Yeah.
and visibility in the world. I mean, to be a woman alone in the world is still shameful. it's still somehow, there's still this kind of, oh, what was I reading? Erica Jong's Fear of Flying, I read recently. That was interesting. We're 1973. And in that book, she talks about how she's so afraid, the character, Isadora Wing, so afraid of being alone, because to be a woman alone means that you've been abandoned or rejected. That's the assumption.
Yeah, it means you failed somehow. Like, why
You
can't
have failed.
Yeah.
Can't be a choice. You must have failed. You must
failed.
be
yeah, and also
there's something wrong with you.
Yep, you don't, and you don't have a wife to support you. Like,
yes. And that's something else that I found, was that the happiest women writers and artists that I found were the ones who found other women to be partners with them in life, whether it was romantic, sexual, or platonic. And the two best examples I found of that were Muriel Spark. She's fascinating. She's from Scotland, actually. And also this Finnish artist and writer, Tove Jansson. I went to this amazing exhibit of hers in Paris, and I'd never heard of her. She's very well known over here in Europe because she created the Moomin characters, who are kind of like the Peanuts for Europe. The Peanuts in Europe are the Moomins, And but she was also this very serious artist and amazing writer. But she had this beautiful, wonderful life partnership with another woman writer, and it's just beautiful. Their the life that they had together, just beautiful. So I don't know what I'm saying here exactly, except for that, I think it's one of the things I've been exploring and interested in, starting with Dora Maar, is what happens to these women writers and artists when they hook up with men,
I feel like a part of them gets subsumed a bit.
Yes, women, you mean?
Their identity and their creativity.
Men. Yes, and I think that is a huge barrier to women being able to see themselves as serious writers and artists. Huge.
Yes.
And it's still, so that's something I really think a lot in my writing, in the memoir, and then in the novel too that I'm thinking of. These are the big issues for me that I'm sort of wrestling with. And it's because it's these women writers and artists of the past who are helping me think through them, helping me understand them. And without them, I'd be lost. And so I think what you're doing is fabulous. And I'm glad that you're starting a podcast now and spreading more stories of women from the past. I think that's very important.
Yes, I'm super excited about it. And thank you again so much. I'm really, really glad I got to snag you as one of my first guests.
Thank you for asking.
Because I love everything that you're working on. And just your story and everything. I think it's so cool. If people want to find out more about you and your work, they can go to your Substack. Anything else that they should check out?
Yeah, I mean, I have a website. It's just my name, anneboydrioux.com. Yeah, so my next newsletter is going to be on Suzanne Valadon. Do you know her? She was a French
Oh my God, I love her
artist.
so much. I went to her studio in Paris.
I did,
yes.
Oh,
she's
I did
amazing.
Too. I went there twice last year, actually. And I've been curious about her, so I've just been doing this research the last couple of days on my, she's so cool. I'm really excited about writing this piece about her.
Yeah, she's super
awesome.
Interesting, like her whole background and everything. And and she's another one who should be way more famous.
Yeah, she was seriously audacious. I just think she's amazing. Yeah. And a great artist, an incredible artist, all self-taught. I mean, she had no training.
Maybe
so
we could do another episode on Suzanne sometime.
To talk about not just like a whole woman's life, but issues, right? Like what can we learn from them? What do they mean to us?
Totally.
What use can we make of their lives and learning about them? All of that. That's kind of what I'm trying to do with my Substack. It's not just, I'm not going to tell Suzanne Valadon's whole story. What I really want to talk about is the taboos that she broke in her depiction of female and male nudes. That's what I want to talk about. It's like amazing what she did.
I want to hear more. I love it.